The cameras were rolling live when Secretary of State Marco Rubio abruptly pointed toward the exit, his face flushed with unmistakable anger. Veteran journalist Sofia Martinez froze, microphone still in hand, as security personnel approached her amid the shocked gasps of other reporters. No one could believe what they were witnessing during what should have been a routine diplomatic press conference in Madrid. The tension in the opulent ballroom of Spain's Ministry of Foreign Affairs was palpable as Sofia settled into her assigned seat, notepad ready and recorder discreetly placed on the polished table before her. This press conference was meant to solidify a historic trade agreement between the United States and the European Union, a crowning achievement in Secretary Rubio's diplomatic career. Sofia had prepared meticulously for this moment, reviewing all previous statements and background materials on the trade negotiations that had stretched over 18 months of delicate talks. She had earned her reputation as one of America's most respected international affairs correspondents through years of balanced reporting and incisive questioning, never shying away from difficult topics, yet always maintaining professionalism. The press conference began with the standard pleasantries, with Secretary Rubio appearing confident and at ease alongside his European counterparts. The trouble started when Sofia raised her hand for the third round of questions. Secretary Rubio nodded in her direction, seemingly untroubled by her presence despite their previous encounters at other international events. Sofia stood, introduced herself as she always did, and began her question about certain controversial provisions within the trade agreement that had not been publicly addressed. Her question was pointed but fair, touching on labor protections that advocacy groups claimed had been weakened during the final rounds of negotiation. Midway through her question, Secretary Rubio's expression changed dramatically, his diplomatic smile vanishing as his eyes narrowed. Before Sofia could finish, he interrupted her sharply, claiming her question contained factual inaccuracies and exhibited clear bias. The room fell silent as the unexpected confrontation unfolded on live television. Secretary Rubio's voice echoed through the stunned room as he accused Sofia of deliberately misrepresenting the agreement to create controversy. The European diplomats shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging concerned glances as the American Secretary of State continued his unexpected rebuke. Sofia attempted to clarify her question, her voice steady despite the growing tension, but Rubio cut her off again with a dismissive wave. His face grew increasingly flushed as he lectured her about responsible journalism and the damage that misinformation could cause to delicate international relationships. The press corps watched in stunned silence, cameras capturing every moment of this diplomatic meltdown that was already streaming live to millions of viewers across the globe. When Sofia tried once more to redirect the conversation back to the substance of her inquiry, Secretary Rubio made the unprecedented decision that would dominate headlines for weeks to come. Without consulting any of his staff or the event organizers, Secretary Rubio pointed directly at Sofia and declared that her presence was disruptive to the proceedings. He instructed security to escort her from the premises immediately, claiming her questioning was not in good faith and represented an attempt to undermine American diplomatic efforts. The Spanish security personnel hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with removing an accredited American journalist at the demand of a foreign diplomat on Spanish soil. Sofia stood her ground, calmly stating that she was simply doing her job by asking substantive questions about matters of public interest. The cameras continued rolling as this extraordinary standoff unfolded, capturing every word and gesture for a global audience watching in disbelief. What had begun as a celebration of international cooperation was rapidly devolving into a spectacle that would raise serious questions about press freedom and diplomatic temperament. The Spanish foreign minister attempted to defuse the situation with a nervous smile, suggesting a brief recess. But Secretary Rubio wasn't finished. He looked directly into the main camera, broadcasting the event, and made a statement that sent shockwaves through the diplomatic community. He claimed that certain journalists were acting as proxies for political opponents who wished to sabotage American foreign policy advances for partisan gain. Without naming names, his implication was clear to everyone familiar with Washington politics. Sophia remained composed even as security reluctantly approached her. She gathered her materials with deliberate slowness, making it clear she was leaving under protest. As she walked toward the exit, followed by several security personnel, she turned briefly to face the assembled press corps and offered a single, powerful statement that would be quoted endlessly in the coming news cycle. She said that when officials fear questions more than they value transparency, democracy itself is endangered. The press conference continued in Sophia's absence, but the damage was done. The trade agreement announcement, meant to be the headline, had been completely overshadowed by the unprecedented ejection of an American reporter by an American diplomat on foreign soil. Back in Washington, phones were already ringing throughout. The State Department and White House's officials scrambled to understand what had happened and formulate a response. News channels split their screens between continuing coverage of the press conference and rapidly assembled panels of experts discussing the implications of what they had just witnessed. Social media exploded with clips of the confrontation, with hashtags like #Rubio meltdown and Sophia strong trending globally within minutes. The incident was rapidly transforming from an awkward diplomatic moment into a full-blown political crisis that threatened to define Secretary Rubio's tenure. At the State Department, Elena Diaz, Sophia's producer at Global News Network, watched the feed from their Madrid bureau with mounting concern. She immediately called the network's legal team, as well as their White House correspondent, to gauge the administration's initial reaction. This wasn't the first time Sophia had asked tough questions of government officials, but never had there been such a dramatic response. As the lawyer on call began outlining potential First Amendment issues, Elena's other line lit up with a call from the network president. The incident was already becoming the biggest media story of the year, with implications for press freedom, diplomatic protocols, and U.S. global standing. Elena knew Sophia well enough to recognize that she wouldn't want to become the story itself, but there was no avoiding it now. Somewhere in Madrid, her reporter was leaving a government building, likely surrounded by cameras and questions, thrust into the center of an international incident that no one had seen coming. Sophia emerged from the ministry building to find a crowd of fellow journalists waiting, their questions coming at her from all directions. She maintained her professional composure, declining to make any inflammatory statements that might escalate the situation further. Instead, she calmly stated that she stood by her question and believed that the public deserved answers about aspects of the trade agreement that would impact millions of American workers. As she made her way to her network's waiting car, her phone buzzed constantly with notifications. Colleagues from across the journalistic spectrum were sending messages of support, while social media was erupting with both defenders and critics analyzing every second of the confrontation. Sophia instructed her driver to take her directly to the network's Madrid bureau, where she could regroup with her team and decide on next steps. She knew that how she responded to this incident would be scrutinized just as heavily as Secretary Rubio's actions. Back in Washington, White House Chief of Staff Michael Anderson was interrupted during a budget meeting with news of the incident. He immediately excused himself and headed to the Oval Office, where President Laura Chen was already watching replays of the confrontation on multiple screens. The president's expression was unreadable as she studied the footage, occasionally asking aides to replay specific moments. Secretary Rubio had been her political ally for years before she appointed him to the State Department, valuing his strategic mind and connections within the international community. But this public display of temper threatened to undermine months of careful diplomacy. The trade agreement had been a centerpiece of her administration's foreign policy agenda, promising economic benefits that would bolster her re-election campaign. Now, all anyone would remember was this explosive confrontation. President Chen turned to her communications director and asked a simple question that set the tone for the administration's response. Was Rubio trying to protect American interests, or had his personal feelings compromised his judgment? The State Department's press office was in crisis mode, with spokesman James Wilson fielding calls from every major news organization in the world. The official statement, released 2 hours after the incident, was carefully worded, acknowledging the importance of press freedom while defending the Secretary's right to ensure accurate information about sensitive diplomatic negotiations. Behind closed doors, however, Secretary Rubio's senior advisors were engaged in heated debate about how to proceed. Deputy Secretary Elizabeth Morgan argued forcefully that Rubio needed to issue a personal apology immediately to contain the damage, while others insisted that showing weakness would only embolden critics. Meanwhile, Rubio himself had secluded himself in his hotel suite, refusing all calls except from the president. Those present during their conversation reported that it was brief and tense, with the secretary appearing visibly shaken afterward. Whatever had been said, it was clear that the administration was at a crossroads in how to handle what was rapidly becoming an international embarrassment. The story took an unexpected turn when Spanish newspaper El País published a bombshell report the following morning. According to confidential sources within the Spanish Foreign Ministry, Secretary Rubio had specifically requested that Sofia Martinez not be permitted to attend the press conference, but Spanish officials had declined to intervene in the media credentialing process. This revelation cast the public confrontation in an entirely new light, suggesting premeditation rather than a spontaneous reaction. The State Department immediately denied the report, dismissing it as baseless speculation from anonymous sources. But the damage was compounding, with questions now swirling about whether Secretary Rubio had harbored a grudge against the reporter from previous encounters. Media organizations began combing through archives of past press conferences, identifying several instances where Sofia had questioned Rubio on sensitive topics, though none had resulted in confrontation before this incident. Sofia Martinez returned to her hotel room after a long day of interviews and discussions with her network executives. She had maintained her professional demeanor throughout, refusing to be drawn into personal attacks against Secretary Rubio despite numerous opportunities. Alone now, she reviewed her notes from before the press conference, confirming that her question had been based on actual provisions within the draft agreement that multiple sources had verified. Her integrity as a journalist was being questioned, in some circles, particularly among commentators sympathetic to the administration. She had spent 15 years building her reputation for fair and thorough reporting, and she wasn't about to abandon her principles now. Opening her laptop, she began writing a detailed account of the incident and the context surrounding her question, determined to set the record straight. As midnight approached in Madrid, her phone lit up with a message from an unknown number. The text was brief but unmistakable in its implications. "There's more to this story than anyone knows. The trade agreement is just the tip of the iceberg." In Washington, a closed-door emergency meeting of the president's senior advisors stretched into the early morning hours. Internal polling was already showing significant damage to the administration's credibility, with the incident reinforcing perceptions among certain voters that the government was hostile to media scrutiny. Secretary Rubio had finally emerged from his seclusion to join the virtual meeting, appearing tired but defiant. He insisted that his reaction had been justified given what he characterized as a pattern of misleading questions from certain journalists, though he stopped short of providing specific examples. President Chen listened silently to the various perspectives offered by her team, her decision regarding Secretary Rubio's future hanging in the balance. The trade agreement, meanwhile, remained unsigned, with European partners indicating privately that they needed time to assess the situation. What should have been a diplomatic triumph had become a political liability that threatened to define the administration's relationship with both the press and international allies. 3 days after the incident, as speculation about Secretary Rubio's future reached a fever pitch, another stunning development changed the narrative entirely. Documents were anonymously leaked to multiple news organizations, revealing that certain provisions of the trade agreement had indeed been secretly modified in the final round of negotiations, just as Sophia's question had suggested. These modifications appeared to favor specific American corporations in ways that contradicted the administration's public statements about the deal's benefits for workers. Global News Network, where Sophia worked, received the most comprehensive set of documents, along with information suggesting that Secretary Rubio had been personally involved in pushing for these changes, despite objections from career diplomats. The authenticity of the documents was quickly verified by experts, forcing the State Department to abandon its previous denials and shift to damage control. Sophia, vindicated by these revelations, faced a crucial ethical decision about how to report on leaks that might have come from inside the government itself. As Sophia prepared for her first broadcast interview since the leaked documents emerged, she reflected on the strange path that had led to this moment. What had begun as a routine question at a press conference had escalated into an international incident, then transformed into a major investigation that could potentially impact both American foreign policy and domestic politics. The network had assigned additional security to her after she received several concerning messages online, a reminder of the heightened tensions surrounding the story. President Chen had announced a formal review of the trade agreement negotiation process, effectively putting the deal on hold indefinitely. European officials were publicly expressing concern about the transparency of American diplomatic efforts. And through it all, Secretary Rubio maintained an increasingly isolated position, with fewer defenders willing to publicly support his actions as new details emerged daily. Sophia straightened her jacket as the studio counted down to the live interview, knowing that the questions she would answer tonight might help determine whether this scandal represented a momentary embarrassment for America or the beginning of a more fundamental reckoning with how diplomacy was conducted in the public interest. The interview catapulted Sophia to unexpected fame, as viewers around the world tuned in to hear her measured account of the incident and subsequent revelations. She carefully outlined the substantive issues with the trade agreement while refusing to speculate about Secretary Rubio's personal motivations. Her professionalism in the face of such public scrutiny earned praise from journalism experts and further isolated those who had attempted to discredit her. Meanwhile, a bipartisan congressional committee announced plans to investigate both the trade agreement negotiations and the treatment of press during international diplomatic functions. Secretary Rubio, who had once been mentioned as a potential presidential candidate, found his political future suddenly uncertain. White House insiders reported that President Chen was particularly disturbed by evidence that she had been kept uninformed about key aspects of the trade negotiations, creating a growing rift with her once trusted Secretary of State. The administration's attempts to refocus public attention on other policy initiatives were failing, with press briefings inevitably returning to questions about Madrid and its aftermath. The final act of the drama came swiftly and unexpectedly. 1 week after the initial incident, President Chen called Secretary Rubio to the White House for what was described as a routine meeting. 2 hours later, a somber president appeared in the press room to announce that she had accepted Secretary Rubio's resignation, effective immediately. She emphasized her continuing respect for his years of public service, while acknowledging that recent events had made it impossible for him to effectively represent American interests abroad. Reading from a prepared statement, she reaffirmed her administration's commitment to both press freedom and transparent diplomacy, announcing a comprehensive review of negotiation protocols for all international agreements. Secretary Rubio released his own statement shortly afterward, expressing regret for what he described as a momentary lapse in judgment while defending the substance of his diplomatic work. He announced plans to return to private life after decades in public service, effectively ending speculation about his political future. Sofia Martinez watched the president's announcement from her office, a Global News Network's Washington bureau, where she had returned to continue reporting on the policy implications of the trade agreement controversy. The story had evolved far beyond the personal confrontation in Madrid, raising important questions about democratic oversight of international negotiations and the public's right to information about agreements made in their name. Sofia had never sought to become part of the story she was covering, but she recognized that sometimes journalism itself became newsworthy when it fulfilled its essential function of challenging power. In the weeks that followed, she declined numerous offers for book deals and exclusive interviews about her personal experience, preferring to focus on the substantive issues that had been obscured by the spectacle. The trade agreement was eventually renegotiated with significantly greater transparency and public input, a development widely credited to the chain of events that began with a single pointed question at a press conference. For Sofia, this outcome represented the true vindication of her work, not the downfall of a powerful figure, but a tangible improvement in how democracy functioned in the shadowy world of international diplomacy.